Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome to part 12 on a series where I show you how to build a simple modern habit tracker called consistency. Yes, I do have my camera on this time. I had hundreds of people telling me, Taha, turn your camera back on. It's more engaging. Your videos are more interesting when you have your camera on. That's a lie. I just had one friend tell me that having my camera on is one thing that could improve my videos. So hopefully this makes it a little bit more engaging as I show you guys the code that we're going to be writing. So anyways, in the last video, we basically finished off the entire user registration process and sign-in. And the last thing that we did was JWT. Now I want to remind you, the whole reason we did that entire thing in the first place that took like 4 or 5 parts was because when the user now goes to, for example, create a new goal, update a goal or delete a goal, or any kind of other resource management thing that's going to be happening in the site, we're able to track that in our system. And we know what actions are associated with what user now. So in terms of building out a more fully fleshed out application, that process was necessary. So in this video, we're going to be implementing 2 key features. The first one is the read goals functionality, because as you can see here, this data that's coming from the backend for our goals list is actually fully hard-coded in our server. And also, we're not able to click here and actually add a goal yet. This entire goals component is just a dummy component. So let's start with the read goals functionality. Now, to implement any of these 2 things, we need to do 3 things for each of them. Modify the component itself, modify the Redux state, and also modify the backend API so that it actually fetches the correct data that's associated with that user. So let's get started by opening up the goals.jsx file. Now, the first thing that you should notice is we're dispatching this get goals action without any parameters in here to specify what users we're fetching the data for. So first of all, we need to specify the user, and we can get that user information from Redux. So I'm going to copy these 2 lines down because we have a use selector, which gets a state from the Redux store, and we want to extract the user state, and we'll save that to user state. Now from user state, we can get logged in user like this. All right, that's pretty straightforward. Right now, we're just getting the logged in user from the Redux state. Now, in the use effect, if we have a logged in user, then we can move the dispatch inside of this if statement. And inside of the get goals function, we're going to send it something called user info. And this is going to be defined up here as an object, which contains only one field, a token. We only want to send the JWT token because with that one token, the backend can extract any information that it needs about the user. So we don't need to send the user ID, the email, name, anything like that. We can straight up just say logged in user.token. Okay, so now we're passing this to Redux. Let's go inside the get goals function, which brings us to the goals slice file. And let's modify this here a little bit. So in this async function, we are passing user info. Okay, now in this try, let's extract the token from user info, because with this, we can add it to the Axios get request. So after the URL of the get request, we're going to pass a config object. And this is going to store a field called headers, which is going to store another object that contains an authorization field. And this has a value of a string, which is going to say bearer, which is a keyword that we use when we're sending tokens to the backend. And then let's append token. All right, so all we basically did here was add one object, which is a config object, after the URL. And we're passing a headers object, which contains an authorization, which has the string bearer along with the token. So now let's save both of these files. And let's go into the backend server.js file. You'll see here that we have a get request handler for the /goals URL. Let's separate this entire thing into its own route file, just like we did up here for the user routes. So I'm going to copy this entire thing here, create a new file under the routes folder, and call it goals routes.js. And I'm going to paste that route that I just took from the server.js. And at the top, let's import express from express. And let's create our router. Const router equals express.router. This is the exact same thing that we did inside of the user routes file if you've been following along with the process, as you can see here. And instead of app.get, we're going to change this to router.get. And let's remove the goals from this URL here. The reason for that is because in the server.js file, we can now create a new app.use, which says /goals here. And it's going to be handled by the goals routes. So just to reiterate, any request that is sent to a URL starting with /goals is going to be handled by the goals routes, which we need to import up here. Import goals routes from ./routes/goals routes. And before I forget, this R should be a capital, and at the bottom of the file, let's export default router. Now, the first thing that we want to do in here is authenticate the user. And if you remember from last video, if you go into the util.js file, we built a function called getAuthUser. And I'm not going to go through and explain this entire thing. If you missed the last part or you want a refresher, check out the video for that one. But basically, we verify the JWT the user sends, and if it passes the verification, we set request.user equal to the decoded value of that token. And so we can basically take this function here and call it before the handler function for this get route. And let's obviously import that as well. Import getAuthUser from one folder back in the util file. And we should have curly brackets around that like this. So if we're inside of this request handler function, we can assume that the getAuthUser has already been called. And so inside of this try, actually, you know what? The way that we're going to be doing the database query, we're going to handle any errors that come when we call the query itself. So I'm going to remove this try catch. It's up to you if you want to keep it, if you plan to use it for other stuff, but I'll show you how I'm going to handle errors here in a sec. And what we can do now is get const authUser from request.user. And remember, if the user is not authorized because their JWT is not valid or for whatever reason, we won't even get inside of that handler function. We're going to return an error before we even get to it. So at this point, authUser here contains all the information that we need for the user, and we simply need to send a query to the database to get all the goals that are associated with this user. But wait, there's one issue here. We don't have a table yet in the database that has or that stores goals. So let's go ahead and do that first. So open up your setupdb.sql file where we set up the user table query previously. And I'm going to paste a new query here. Where is it? Here it is. All we're doing here is creating a table called goals with a bunch of different columns. The first one is ID, and we use this keyword serial here because it signifies three things. Serial is basically an alias for a big integer that gets automatically incremented and is unsigned, meaning the ID can't be negative. Next, we have the name of the goal, and we're going to store 50 characters for that. The user ID stores the ID of the user that's associated with this particular goal, and we say foreign key user ID here because this user ID field references the ID field of the user's table. Okay, this is where we get the linking between a field in the goals table and a field in the users table, okay, because it's a foreign key. OnDelete cascade here basically just means if the user with this ID is deleted from the users table, also delete the goals that are associated with that user. Since we have all our create table commands in one file, I'm going to comment out the first command because we don't want to run that one at the moment. And let's go to the command line. So if you recall from a few videos ago, here's how you access your Postgres through the terminal. -u Postgres. Type in your password. And let's do \c to connect to the consistency tutorial database. And if you type \dt for describe tables, you can see we only have one table called users. Now, to run the commands that are in this setup.db.sql file, let's type \i for include the backend of the db folder and setup.db.sql. So we can see that we got the create table command done. And if we type dt again, we have a goals table. You can even type \d for describe goals, and it shows you all the information about the goals table. So now going back to fetching the goals for a particular user, let's set up the query for that. So this is pretty simple. Let's set const find goals query equal to an object where we have a text that contains our query, and we'll have some values that contains variables that we want to pass to the query. So we're going to say select everything from goals where user ID equals $1, and $1 represents the first variable in this values array, and that is going to be authUser.id. All right, that looks good so far. Let's now actually run this query. So let's set const query response equal to await pool.query, and we'll pass in find goals query. Now, obviously we need to import pool, which it automatically did for us. That's great. And since we're using awaits here, we need to put the keyword async before our function definition, or actually before the parameters. So we have this query response after pool.query does its job. But what if there's an error? Let's catch that here using a function. And all it's going to do is return res.send. Actually, let's do status first to 401. And as usual, let's now send our object that contains the error. The param is going to be read error. And the message is going to be error fetching goals. All right. And now finally, we can get rid of this hard-coded goals array and set it to query res.rows. And that's what we're going to be returning back to the front end. So this looks good so far. Let's save it and take a look at the front end. So as expected, we don't see any goals here yet because we obviously haven't added any goals that are associated with our particular user at the moment. And so we can verify this once again after we finish the add goal functionality. So for now, let's check this first one off the list and move on to creating goals. Actually, a couple little things I wanted to show you before I move on. If we open up the util.js file and look at the errors that are being returned from the getAuth user function, we're simply returning one object. But in order to be consistent with what we've been doing in our system so far, I want to return a list of error objects. All right, so we can close that now. And in this use effect for goals.jsx, if we have an error and error at 0 dot param is auth error, then we want to dispatch the logout action because this user is not authorized. Logout user, just like that. And I think it automatically imported it. Awesome. Okay, couple other little things. At the bottom here, when we're mapping over the list of goals, a Reddit user actually commented and told me that using the index number as the key for a React component is actually not the best practice. What we should be using is the ID of the item itself. So we can say goal.id here. And I searched it up, and even on the React documents, it says that using the index as a key is in fact not the best practice. So let's save this now. And let me add another equal sign here. And let's change the div for the error to an error section style div or styled component. And instead of just displaying error fetching goals, let's display a specific error that was returned, which is error at 0.message. Also, since we're now using error and logged in user inside of the use effect, we need to add those as dependencies. Forgot to create this little styled component, so let's do that. Const error section equals styled.div. And all I wanted to do is have color red. All right, let's move on. And the last little edit I wanted to make is in the user routes file. When a user registers, and we have this query here that inserts that user into the database, what we are not doing is returning the ID along with the rest of the information. So let's do that and hit save. Okay, cool. Now let's actually start working on creating a goal. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that whenever we're making a create, read, update, or delete functionality, we need to first change the component itself, we need to add Redux state to it, and we need to fix the backend API. So let's start with the component. You can see here that we have an add goals button laid out like this and currently has no functionality. Let's move this into its own component. So in this same goals folder, let's make another new folder called add goals button. Actually, add goal singular. Create the index file for it, create the component file, .jsx, set up the basic structure of the component. All right, so here's the basic structure. Let's paste the button that we took from goals.jsx. And we also need this styled component. But you can see the name of this styled component is the same as the name of the component itself. So I'm going to call this button here inner add goal button. And the name of the component is add goal button. Let's save it. And also in the index.js file, let's export default from /add goal button. We can close that up now. And let me also take the styled component for add goal button, which is here. We can cut it, paste it into add goal button, change the name to inner add goal button. And in the goals.jsx file, let's actually now import add goal button from this folder. And let's now put it back in the header. So let's see if it still shows up. We're missing some more imports. Let's import styled from styled components. And great, it's looking exactly like it was before, but now it's in its own component. So we can start making more changes here. So let me show you real quick what we actually want to achieve by pressing this button. So as you can see, once we hit this new goal button, a modal like this should pop up. Okay, and here we have a simple form where if we enter whatever name, or actually if we don't enter a name, we get an error. But if we enter a name, then it pops up here in our list of goals at the bottom. This is what we want to achieve. Now, the first thing we need to do is actually create this modal itself. Now this I tried doing from scratch on my own when I was building out this demo project, but it was actually really time consuming, and there's quite a bit of detail you have to handle when you're creating a modal from scratch. So the library that I found that worked best for me was called React Responsive Modal. And so this is what I'm going to be using for this project. So I'll put this link in the description below, but let's start off by first installing this library. So I'll take this command and go into the front end folder of the site and paste that command here. Okay, cool. So we have that installed now. Let's take a quick look at how we're actually going to be using it. So first, we're going to import the modal itself. Then we have a state that keeps track of when the modal is open and closed, and then just some functions that control the open and close state. So the first thing we actually need to do is import this styles.css line, which is going to give us all these nice styles here that come with the modal. So we need to put this line that I just copied from here into the index.js file of our project. So let's open that up here. And at the bottom of the imports, we can just put this. So now anywhere we put the modal within our application, we'll have the correct styles for it. Let's close that up. And back in this add goal button, I'm going to take this line too, importing the modal from React Responsive Modal, and paste that up here. Let's also just take some of their use state stuff, because why not, and put that as part of our component as well. Except I like to rename my stuff a little bit. So I'm going to say show modal, which is the Boolean that's going to control when the modal is being shown. It's going to start off as false because we're not showing it. And I'm going to remove the on keywords just because I prefer it. So open modal is going to set show modal to true or to false, depending on what they click. So now after this button, let's actually use the modal itself, which actually, you know what, we can probably just copy this line here as well and paste it here like that. Okay, so what's with all these errors? Oh, so the reason for this is because we have two components side by side in the return. And what we actually need to return is one component. So we need to have a parent for everything. And so I'm just going to put kind of an empty component like this, which is called a fragment. And now we're returning one component and it has multiple items inside it, which is fine. So now inside of this modal, for now, let's just say test just to see if it works. And then for open, the Boolean that tracks whether it's open is show modal. On close, we will call the close modal function, and this just centers the modal in the center of the screen. Now, when we click this inner add goal button, we need an on click, which is actually what's going to prompt the modal to open. So in this on click, we're just going to say open modal. All right, let's see how this works so far. We're not importing use state, so let's do that. Use state. Anything else? Nope. And currently our modal looks something like this because we're obviously not properly styling the content inside of it. But this is nice because we can click outside of the modal and it goes away. We can click escape. It also closes. And also this close button does the same thing. So now let's simply add the content that we want inside of the modal, which is all of this stuff here. So to start off, inside of the modal, I'm going to create a styled component called modal content container. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is put all my styled components and then I'll create them at once above. So now we want a modal title styled component, and this title is going to say create a new goal. Capitalize that. Afterwards, we need an input section. And so if you remember from the user registration stuff we were creating, you obviously do remember because we spent like 4 videos on it. We had an input section styled component. So I'm going to literally take one of these and put it in my add goal button after the modal title. Okay, so now we have an input section. The label is going to be for create goal, and this is going to say enter a goal name. And so this is basically this section up here. It's this label for the form. Okay, and if there's an error, we're going to show the error section styled component, and I'm just going to say enter a goal name. Okay, now for this input tag, the type is text The ID is going to be goal name. The placeholder will be goal name, max length 50. And we'll write this on change function in a sec. Let's just comment it out for now. Now, obviously, we're going to get a ton of errors because we're missing a whole bunch of styled components. So let's put those above. Now, you guys know I hate writing out CSS. So here's what I'm going to do. Bang. We have the modal content container. It has display flex direction to column. And the reason for that is because everything is flowing top to bottom within our modal. And the width is going to be 375 pixels. Next, we need the modal title. So I'll put that here. And I am taking these from the demo project that I already have built out. But feel free to pause it here and copy this if you're following along. I am trying my best to explain why I have these styles in there. So we're just setting the font size to 30 pixels for the title. And we're adding a margin bottom of 20 pixels. Pretty straightforward. Next, we need this input section, which we can take from the register component. So if we look up here, we have this nice styled component here that we can put into the add goal button file. So we got that. What else do we need? Error is not defined and error section is not defined. Okay, so for the errors here, we can actually just create another state and we'll call it show error like this. It's going to start off as false. And in this JavaScript over here, if show error is set to true, then we'll show this error section. And we need the styled component for this, which we can also take from register.jsx. You could probably add a bunch of reusability here by moving common components such as error section and input section into one file and import them. But this project is fairly small, so I haven't been doing that. But let's see if we can at least load the modal up now. So if we click this button, we have something that looks like what we want pretty much. So that's good so far. But we're missing a submit button, as you can see. And the submit button is also another piece we can take from the register.jsx file. So at the bottom, we have a button container with a submit button inside it. Let's copy that, put it into the modal content container after the input section. And let's take the styled components for button container and submit button. And they're right over here, button container and submit button. And we can paste that up here. All right, handle submit is not defined. So now we need a function that's going to handle when we submit the form. So const handle submit is a function, and let's leave it empty for now. Make sure it loads up. It's being centered right now, which is not what I want it to look like. So in the styled components, let's change this justify content center to flex start. And now, once it reloads, it looks exactly like we want it to. Perfect. Let's change this register text to create goal. So now that it's looking good, let's make sure we're actually tracking the information that we should be, which is the goal name itself. So let's create a state for that. Set goal name, make that a capital G, and it's going to start off as an empty string. Now, once we enter something in the input section, let's uncomment this. On change, we want to run a function that's going to change the value of goal name as the user is typing. So as you know, we can give it a parameter E, which stands for the event that's currently happening. We actually don't need these curly brackets here. We can say set goal name now to e.target.value. So now once the form is submitted, let's first of all check if the goal name is empty. Then we will set show error to true and return. Otherwise, we will write this out in a second, but let's just say dispatch create goal action. Okay, this is what we want to do if there's no error. Well, let's double check that an error does pop up if it's empty, which it does, so that's awesome. And so that should do it for the component itself. Now let's move on to the second step, which is to manage the Redux flow for creating a goal. You know what, on second thought, I'm actually going to end this video here. This part has gone on for a bit of time, and I know we still have to do the Redux state and we still have to create the backend API for creating a goal. But I got a midterm in 2 days that I haven't studied for yet pretty much. So I do have to end this part here and actually prepare for it. It's on software testing. Also, forgive me if it's taking a long time to finish this entire project. I am trying to balance, family life and school at the same time as making these videos. And my goal is to just put out one part of the project every week. And I'm just trying to stick with that. So actually, you know what? One little tiny thing I do want to change is this error pops up, but when you close the modal, it's still here. So this is a very quick fix before I end it off. Inside of the close modal, we need to do more than one thing. So other than just setting show modal to false, we need to also set show error to false. And now let's reload it. Once we have an error here, close the modal and come back, it's gone. All right, yeah, that thing was just bothering me a little bit. But yeah, we'll continue building out the Redux logic as well as building out the backend API, along with updating and deleting goals as well. So I hope you guys have found this series helpful so far, whether you're coding along with it or just observing to see how an application like this is built in React. Feel free to like and subscribe so you can follow along with the process of building out this entire system, and I'll see you next week. Bye.